We're live.
All right, welcome everybody. It is House Energy and Digital Infrastructure on Thursday, February 12th. And we'll go around the room and introduce ourselves and then turn it over to you for the record. We are continuing our discussion of H727, an act relating to sustainable data center deployment. I'm Representative Kathleen James from Manchester.
Scott Cabell from St. Johnsbury. Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Benning. Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Derek Torrey, Washington 2.
Laura Simelia, Wyndham 2.
Great.
Jane Philbrick, South Royalton.
Austin Hopping, UP Dicker.
Dana Lee Perry with the Crescent Group.
All right, for the record.
Shana Loisel with Vermont Electric Power Company, and I'm accompanied by my colleague, Mark Scarata, and Belco's General Counsel, and the subject matter expert around Federal Energy Regulatory Commission proceedings and some of the issues that we're seeing with data center topic of conversation within the federal context. So, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself when you're right. So to start with, we know the committee has heard from some other utilities and the Department of Public Service on H727. Most of what we share today is going to align with that testimony. It might sound a little familiar. The department did a really excellent job of covering most of what we were going to touch upon today. So hopefully our testimony will add a little bit of color, and we're obviously here to answer any questions that haven't been answered already. Our testimony today will add the perspective from transmission planning and the interconnection side. I want to flag just a few key points at the outset, and then I'll hand it over to Mark, and Mark can walk through some of the details, and we're here to answer any questions. So number one, and many of you already know that Belco is a transmission utility. We do not have retail customers in the same way that a distribution utility would have. We're federally regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And when it comes to interconnection and tariffs, right, those are the rules that we are following. The federal rules are evolving. As you heard, FERC is taking up a few proceedings to find a way to solve for these issues in terms of grid reliability and prices for customers, expensive rates for ratepayers. Data center, the interconnection discussion is rapidly evolving, and there's obviously a heightened focus both from the regulator and utility side. To date, there are no current requests for data center interconnection to Belco's system, and there's no standardized load interconnection process within ISO New England today, and that's important for us because we follow their processes. Should I pause? Okay.
Yeah, because I want to understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to maybe repeat the standardized interconnection and just explain that a little bit.
Absolutely. And this was just an intro to tell you what you're about to hear. And we'll walk through this in a little bit more detail.
That sounds like
Okay, that's, yeah.
I'll address that.
Okay, on we go.
All right. So Mark will highlight that process. Wholesale pathway is the only pathway for connecting to Belco's transmission system. And there are some caveats there that Mark will walk through. And then, as always, reliability first. The customer that is coming, a large load customer that would be coming to interconnect to Vermont or New England, would be required to go through very comprehensive planning studies to understand and determine what upgrades would be required to do no harm to the grid. So those are really the kind of the 6 main messages that we were coming with today. So with that,
There were 6?
there were.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe you could submit written testimony
I'd be happy.
in retrospect. Okay, great. I
So
wrote down one main thing. Maybe I
There was a
blocked
lot
it all
in there.
together. Okay. All right.
So I'll hand it over to you, and if you want to.
So I'm Mark Scarata, Shana said. I'm Belco's General Counsel. I've been at Belco for 18 years. Before that, I was across the parking lot at the Attorney General's office for about a decade. I worked for Bill Sorrell. I was their lead water lawyer and one of their appellate lawyers. I love that job. I live around the corner from here, and I love this job. It's really great. It's a great place to work. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I have got summaries of some of the testimony that you've heard already, and I've heard a little bit about some of the testimony you got earlier today. So I apologize if I'm repeating things other folks have said, but I think the perspective I'll bring today is kind of how does the federal framework fit into all of this, if at all? And I guess I want to start with the piece that Shayna led off with, which is Velco's essentially mostly a creature of federal law and regulation, and there is an aspect of cooperative federalism when it comes to energy law. So interstate electrons, the transmission electrons, high voltage, is essentially regulated by FERC, by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. At least the rates and the planning and the reliability aspects, that all falls in the federal bucket. And what has been reserved to the states is, for us at least, a siting authority, which is different than your distribution utilities. Those electrons are, even though this is not true as a matter of physics, those electrons are deemed to stay in state, and the rates that the distribution utilities charge are governed by state law and subject to the PUC, and they also have siting authority. So there's this divide of jurisdiction between state and federal law, and that comes into play here, because if someone wants to become a customer of the electric grid, they want to take service in Vermont, and this is true for New England and for many swaths of the country. They take the service from the distribution utility, and it's subject to state law. It's either a state-approved tariff or a state-approved contract that they take that service to. So the distribution utility is providing that service to them. The distribution utility, in turn, is taking transmission service and passing along those costs. It's called bundled service for the customer. The customer is getting their distribution charges, their energy charges, and their transmission charges all together. Another way of saying this is kind of how Shayna said it, which is that Velco doesn't have any retail customers. We don't care how big you are. You can't take service from us unless you are a distribution utility, because we provide a wholesale service to utilities to provide service to an end user. So data centers would be end users. So that's one of the reasons why in the region there's not a system set up to for data centers to take service directly from a transmission company, and that's why the federal government is starting to look at this now. Yes.
I do want to stop there.
Yes.
Does that mean they can't do it? Or does it mean there's not a process in place if they want to do it? I
They
need to
cannot,
understand that
under
difference.
state law in Vermont, you cannot take retail transmission service. Vermont does not allow for retail transmission service. And that is true in most of the states in New England, with some narrow exceptions. And I'll give you an example. In Massachusetts, you can't take retail service as a retail customer, end use customer. You're not passing it on to somebody, using it for your own purposes. You cannot take that service directly from the ISO New England. You have to take it through an Eversource distribution utility or a national grid distribution utility. I just want to cover one exception to that is they have carve out for things like Amtrak and the Massachusetts Transportation Authority.
Mm-hmm.
They're allowed to take service, but that's an exception.
So Global Foundries.
Yes, this is like the footnote to all this is that Global Foundries found itself in kind of a unique situation. And if folks are familiar with that, that's obviously a what we call a large load. They're taking 50 or more megawatts of power off the system, and they used to take their distribution and transmission service through Green Mountain Power. And a few years ago, Green Mountain Power was taken out of the mix, and we were set in the same situation where Velco could not provide retail transmission service directly to Global Foundries. Global Foundries created a self-managed utility, essentially a distribution utility of one, to accept the power be subject to state regulation like the rest of the utilities, and then it essentially resells that power to Global Foundries. That's basically, and that is one of the scenarios. A great question, because this kind of gets to the punchline here, which is so all of the things being equal, a data center would be a customer of a distribution utility in whatever geography that a territory that distribution utility has. So if it was here, it'd be Green Mountain Power. If it was a few miles down the road, it'd be Washington Electric Cooperative.
And what's Global Foundries load roughly?
I think it's 50,
Yeah,
50 megawatts, something like that. Yeah, it's pretty big.
So, all things being equal, a data center would typically be a customer of the distribution utility and have to go through all of the state laws and the state regulatory framework. But GF feels like a loophole or an end around. So could a data center, how does one go about trying to become the next
Yeah, that's a good
the next
question.
Global
And I
Foundries?
don't know if it's apples to apples, and that's probably a better question for the Department of Public Service. Frankly, it wouldn't be one that Velco would answer, but I think there is a potential pathway, at least, that if a data center wanted to take transmission service and say did not want to take service from Green Mountain Power, just as an example, because for many reasons they want to take out the middle person, they don't want to have the energy efficiency charges, they don't want to be dealing with the renewable portfolio standard, or whatever reason they wanted access to buy their own power and not have to have the distribution utilities do that searching in the marketplace for them. They wanted direct access to the wholesale energy market. The only way I can think of conceivably they could do that would be the same way that Global Foundries did. It would have to be another utility set up, a self-managed utility. Okay. I think that probably covers most of what I would say under at least the existing landscape, which is, again, if you're a retail customer, regardless of whether you're a home, a business, or a data center, in Vermont and most of the states, you take retail service from a distribution utility. And let me just say, as a little bit of an aside, if there are places where a data center could connect to the transmission system, like not go through the whole distribution system, and that's physically possible. There's all kinds of protections in place before anybody interconnects, whether you're a generator or load, to make sure, as Shana alluded to this, there's all kinds of studies that are done to say, if your load or your generator, you want to tap into the transmission system, you have to prove to the ISO that you're going to do no harm, essentially. Or if there is going to be harm, that you're going to pay for the equipment and poles and wires that need to be in place to avoid a dip in reliability. And you have to pay for that. So there's protections around reliability and costs.
Okay. So what's interesting to me is that this is a newer topic for me, but so we're hearing that that DPS is looking at sort of ratepayer protection and impacts on ratepayers, as well as grid reliability. Velco has the lens of grid reliability and load, and so it feels to me like, all right, good. What I'm seeing is, different entities looking at this from their own particular, perhaps more narrow viewpoint. And so we either want to make sure that we have a protective mechanism around every single possible viewpoint, or that somebody, and maybe it's going to have to be the legislature, is taking a holistic 360-degree view at how we protect everything.
I think when it comes to the grid itself, everybody is in alignment with that. And I would say that extends all the way up to the current federal administration. Like, they don't want an unreliable grid either. This is a engineer's kind of mindset. An unreliable grid serves no interest, regardless of your political persuasion. So right now, FERC, at the behest of the DOE, FERC is undertaking a rulemaking. I'm sure folks have probably heard about this, but this rulemaking would essentially try to find a way to do what I just said was not possible under state law. It would be to shift jurisdiction that currently sits with the state, the ability to regulate retail rates, and move that, at least for data centers, for data center retail service to allow the federal government to make those decisions instead of the state.
So
Yes.
I have questions.
Mhm.
So in that case, we would still have citing authority.
Yes, they've made that very clear in the proposed rule that that citing would still be reserved to states.
And our environmental regulations around water, like all of Act
Yes.
250 would still come into play.
Yes, all the V5
Yeah.
components, yes.
But what would be cut out is so you're not buying it now, you're not accessing through the distribution utility, therefore you are not subjected to the energy efficiency charge,
Any of this,
potentially the gross receipts tax, potentially the renewable energy, not potentially, the renewable energy standard. So you're connecting right to the main.
yes,
And so that is then putting you into, are you then competing with the utilities for power?
you could be for sure. And that's happening in some other states.
Mm.
For example, in Puget Sound Energy was a distribution utility looking to buy a big solar facility as part of their own renewable portfolio standard. And they bid on this project. It was already built, up and running. And Microsoft just came in and said, we'll just outbid you so they could have that for their data center.
So not to get too far down that road, you would have to meet our environmental regulations.
For the siting, yes, you would have to meet all the water and
Before you
aesthetics and before you.
Even with this rule in place.
Yes, because if before the laws change, right? Like I've read this bill, which essentially moves siting of the data center itself into the PUC and under section basically like a 248, but it's essentially Act 250. Today, I think, right, it would be if a data center came in today, I think they would have to do the data center itself, the building, under Act 250, and then the interconnection would be a state regulated
And I think the PUC has recommended that you keep it in 250.
250. Oh,
Yeah.
I
And the
didn't.
department, sorry, we'll get
You
you.
may have mentioned that to me, but I don't know.
But the interconnecting to, if they would be interconnecting to a distribution utility, if you have to build any type of facilities to interconnect, then they'd have to take local service from a distribution utility. That would be part of a 248 application.
So there'd be both.
Yes.
And so what you're talking about, and this federal rule has not come into place yet.
No.
They're working on, there's a way to do it.
Yes.
So if that federal rule comes into play, our environmental rules still hold,
Your siting rules still.
lighting rules still hold,
Yes.
but the connection,
The connection would be, and the rates and terms that the data center is paying for electricity are going to be governed by whatever FERC thinks
Hmm.
is just and reasonable. Even if it was done under federal law, the PUC may say that does not seem fair to me. That seems like, just giving an example, like if there was a sweetheart deal under this that, regular retail customers were paying a higher rate, for example, than the data center, the PUC would not be able to intervene and regulate that.
And sorry, what about the res? I missed what you said about the res would be knocked out or still relevant?
It would, if you are taking service through, of course, the details are not clear
I know,
yet
but
in the
yeah.
federal rule because it hasn't been made final yet. But conceivably, what would happen is if you're taking service under federal law, there is no renewable energy standard in federal law, so that the rate that the data center would pay under a federal energy tariff would presumably not have a renewable portfolio, renewable energy standard component to it.
so something that is now kind of clicking in for me is we can likely protect ourselves from environmental impacts through our robust environmental processes. And right now, we have the ability to deal with rate pressures that could result.
You have control over the rate structure essentially. Yes.
and emissions in many ways. However, if this federal rule were to come into place, there would be rate pressures that we would not potentially be able to through competition.
Yeah,
There's
I think
competition
that really
anyway.
remains to be seen how even the rule itself doesn't say like, here's what the rate structure would be for a data center. It just basically says that the federal government would determine.
I wonder if you could highlight a little bit about the proceeding and the advance notice of proposed rulemaking process. And it's not just, this is a proposed advance notice of proposed rulemaking that the Department of Energy sent to FERC, asking them to consider these new rules. And part of it is this federal jurisdiction over transmission level interconnection, but there are other principles within their proposal, including curtailment.
Yeah, it's a little bit messy, but this proposed rule, first of all, it's a little bit of an anomaly. Most times federal rules kind of like crawl at a snail's pace because there's a lot of process in the beginning, lots of comments, because what you're trying to do is make it airtight against litigation. Basically, so there's a lot of process, just like the state rules are done. This one came out a letter came out in the fall from DOE directing FERC to get a rule on the books by the end of April that would allow data centers to interconnect at the transmission level, and if needed, direct the ISOs like the ISO New England and PJM, et cetera, to develop tariffs to allow them to do that. And that doesn't exist today because of the thing I told you before, which is that the states have had historically jurisdiction over that. So as you can probably imagine, a lot of the comments that came in were, they said a bunch of other things too, which were not controversial. Like if upgrades are required to the transmission system, the data center should pay for them. We should ensure that there's reliability. Those kinds of things. But the controversial thing is moving the goalposts, or moving the, not that the goalpost is the right word, but moving the jurisdictional line for, yes, exactly. I mean, changing the referee to the federal referee. Yeah.
Where would the electric bill come from? And who would the data center pay?
The data center would pay in our case, the ISO New England. They would come up with some kind of, today, like the distribution utility pays what's called an RNS, a regional network service. That's the traditional basic transmission service. They would get something like that. And I'm not sure how it would be constructed, like whether it would be based on their particular usage or some other thing, but they would pay it. They would pay that directly to the ISO New England. So there would be no, like, the distribution utility would not be getting any money through this.
And then what? Like, what happens to the money?
Well, the ISO uses that money to help support the rest of the transmission system.
Regionally.
Yes. So I guess I should say there's two different charges here. We're talking about the transmission service, which is the charge for the privilege of using the transmission system. They would have their own contracts, presumably to buy energy.
Power. Okay.
Power.
I see.
And maybe this kind of gets to Shane's point, which is some of the data centers are also talking about co-location. This is a kind of term of art around data centers, which is you have a data center, and I'm going to borrow your bottle. They're a 20 megawatt data center, and they put a 20 megawatt generation facility there. So they say, we're connected to the grid, but we don't really need you. We're going to be on here, but in emergencies, we need you. And then there's this whole question of, well, should they be paying just when they need us, or should they be paying, because the transmission infrastructure is there all the time, like, should they be paying a fair amount? But that's an open question, and that will have to be meted out in the rulemaking as well.
So if this rule passed and we had a data center in Vermont and they were connected to the transmission system through the federal rule, the data center would still have to purchase power.
Correct.
And are they limited in Vermont law? Like, would they have to purchase power from a Vermont utility?
No. It would be a wholesale. They would be buying it off the wholesale transmission system, which is federally regulated, which is open access, so they can.
Could they buy power from a Texas utility? No.
I don't think so. I think
To be
they have to buy
within our region.
within the
ISO. It'd have to be within the
ISO
region.
Yeah.
I say that, but I think there's probably ways they might be able to buy it from, say, Hydro-Quebec or some other aspects. That's outside of my area of expertise. since Velco doesn't buy or sell power.
And so just in terms of completing the thread of the federal process, after the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and timelines are very uncertain right now. This is a little, we haven't seen quite this style of an advance notice of proposed rulemaking happening in the way that it's started with the data centers. And after they've completed the getting all the comments that they have from stakeholders, it goes into a more formal process, which I believe does have formal rules in terms of timeline, correct?
Well, they're expected to, and they've been directed to issue a final rule by the end of April. Whether that's realistic or not, I don't know. But if they follow that mandate, they will issue a final rule. It'll be published in the Federal Register, and there's a lag time of 30 to 60 days before it becomes effective. And the rule would say, the rule wouldn't say, like, after those 90 days, you wouldn't be able to connect your data center. The rule would require the regional transmission operators, the ISOs, to develop tariff language and come up with these processes and contracts, for lack of a better word, within a certain number of days. And then when that became effective, well, it would be months.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how long they would give them, but a typical time frame is you issue a final rule, and then you get 6 months to come up with language, 6 months to 9 months to come up with language that you have to file at FERC. FERC has to accept it, make sure it complies with their directives, and then you would have an effective date on top of that would be a little bit further up. That's assuming no litigation and a court doesn't get involved and say, for example, stay the rule, which is a possibility here, especially for this one. This is like a big jurisdictional rule, and you're going to have a bunch of states coming in, and
Every state.
Yeah, the rules from FERC are typically, if they're challenged in the DC federal court in the District of Columbia. There's this rule known as the 13.2 rule for the legal conoscente, which is that court has a higher incidence of overturning agency rules than other courts do. I'm not saying this one, I'm not judging or handicapping this one in particular, but it could be subject to challenge there. But if that didn't happen, I think what you're looking at for this particular rule, if it was issued in April, sometime next year, we would be seeing data centers potentially applying under a new set of tariffs that the ISO would issue. Again, that's all speculative.
So I think Vermont is considered, sorry, am I right?
Yeah, I looked at you.
Okay. I think Vermont is considered to be not, and New England to be not that attractive because of our rates. But so does this in any way change that if there were that federal?
Well, what I would say is I'm not an expert in the construction or planning of data centers, but the things they look for are low latency fiber connectivity. That's like, they have to have them. They have to have access to water. They have to have access to land that is near reliable power. And then I won't tell you where I heard this because I can't give you the attribution, but I did hear today somebody say, whose input I trust, that what they have heard is that the data centers really don't care about the rates that much. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they have said. I don't care about the rates that much because they're making so much money at these things that that's not their biggest concern.
But they do care about the generation sources being reliable and available and ample.
Yeah, reliability is really important to them because they're usually running 24/7.
So the different ISOs will have different tariffs. Some will be more attractive.
Possibly, that's possible. Yeah, they'll all have to conform to the general rule, but there's the federal government, FERC allows for what they call regional variability because the regions have different interests sometimes.
So within the PJM territory, which is in those mid-Atlantic states, it's one of the biggest ISOs in the country. There is FERC opened a proceeding specifically for PJM, because this is the hotspot of data centers and the issues, these critical issues that are coming up in terms of the capacity being there for all load users and the impacts to ratepayers. And so there's this proceeding, the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is inclusive of all stakeholders, and ISO New England, the New England States Committee on Electricity, ratepayer advocate types are very engaged in that process and submitting comments and tracking and monitoring in the same way that we are for the grid reliability purposes. But at the same time, FERC sees that the issue within PJM is really what needs to be fixed. And so they've opened an additional proceeding specific to PJM where they're asking them to prove to us that your tariffs are just and reasonable. And if not, come up with a tariff that is just and reasonable. So these two proceedings are happening in parallel. And speculatively, I would say that one might aid the other in terms of what comes out of this conversation around PJM.
The PJM proceeding actually has resulted in an order for PJM to develop a couple of new ways, new tariffs. The tariffs are just essentially pro forma contracts that that are used in the electric world, so everybody's operating off of the same terms. They have in PJM was a little bit narrower. They weren't talking about all data centers. What they were trying to do is figure out how to fast track data centers that didn't have some of the baggage that data centers have generally. Like if you're a data center, you're 50 megawatts, that creates a problem for squeezing the energy market because you have existing customers and existing generation. And if you add somebody who's going to take more, obviously, like it tilts the supply and demand in a way that can cause price constraints. But what they have said, listen, if you're not going to be one of those data centers, if you're going to be a data center that brings your own generation, or if you're going to be a data center that is willing to be curtailable, like you allow us to turn you off in times of need, then we're going to fast track you. And FERC has said to PJM, we want you to start working on those pro forma contracts to allow that to happen. So that's what
I'm going to ask about that, because that seems like those two things seem like the principal possible positive benefits to our grid and our situation is bringing your own power and flexible.
Yes. Bring your own power is great. I would say like that is a good solution. Devil in the details. If you're taking an existing resource and kind of stealing it from the pool that's out there, not so good.
Well, potentially, but flexible curtailment.
But curtailment, yes,
is another benefit. And those seem like the major two benefits. I can't think of anything else off from what I've heard so far. And those elements would be well, it's speculation, I guess, at this point. But would those be negotiated or regulated at the FERC level or at the FERC level?
Yeah.
So not the ISO level.
Well, if so, it's a little bit. So if you're asking so FERC would say to the ISOs, come up with a tariff that will allow a data center to, with its own generation, give it a pathway. Come up with a pathway for that generation to come on quicker. I think that's part of what's going on in this. What we're expecting to come out of this proposed rule. The same things happen in PJM kind of on a piecemeal basis. I think this proposed rule is going to say, come up with a plan to integrate data centers and essentially bypass state jurisdiction on the rates. Also make it a fast track for the ones that are less problematic because they bring their own energy.
So a carrot approach instead of a stick approach that is saying that you can fast track permitting if you help solve the problem, as opposed to restricting data centers to that kind of.
Yes, they're not restricting data centers.
That's not what they're trying to do.
And it's not clear to me. I don't know enough about data centers to know whether curtailability is really in the business model.
It doesn't seem like it.
To me, it doesn't seem.
Yeah.
It wouldn't either, but I don't know enough I haven't not run a data center, so I don't know if you can be subject to turning on and off.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I feel like this testimony might be more confusing and more
No.
raising more questions than it's answering for the committee, but
Well, that's just our way. So did you have more? Are you still working your way through your comments?
I think I've covered the federal piece. I'll just say that is for us, that's the game changer. I think that's a game changer in Vermont and in New England if it comes here potentially. Against the backdrop of, let's remember that no one has been knocking on Velco's door to say we want to connect the data center. So we haven't
Right.
heard that. There's been what we would call people maybe kicking the tires or sniffing around in Vermont and in New England. But there's nothing that's been real. The first thing that happens if somebody wants to interconnect load to a transmission level or even a distribution level is they literally have a conversation, decide is it plausible, and then they want to go further than that. They have a feasibility study where they actually crunch some numbers. This is worth studying further. And if they got really serious, and we don't have anything that's approached this in New England or in Vermont specifically, we would conduct a system impact study to say, okay, this sounds very real. Let's see if we plug you into the system here, what upgrades would we need to the system to make sure it's reliable? And I will say there's not a process dedicated to integrating load that way and studying load that way in New England, but they have a proxy for that. They already have a system to study generation coming in. It's not apples to apples, but what they would do is if there was say 5 generators wanted to interconnect in a particular area and a data center wanted to interconnect, they would study them all together. ISO would study them all together, but the host transmission company would really lead the study, but it would be done together. And they would look at them. First of all, they would make sure they're all real. By real, I mean, they have skin in the game. They have developed plans. They own property. They're not just sniffing around. They're not going to waste people's time because these studies cost money. So they're going to study this stuff, see, okay, if all these 4 or 5 things come onto the grid around the same time, what upgrades are we going to need? And then they would allocate the cost of those based on who's benefiting the most out of it.
Yeah.
So it's a little more complicated than I'm describing, where I'm just saying there's just one data center. Most likely it's going to be that the studies are going to involve some dynamics.
So Commissioner Johnson this morning was talking about the need for a technical conference to kind of establish the baselines for Vermont around this issue. I'm presuming that Velco would participate in such a.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and would the ISO also participate in something like that?
I think if they were invited, they would at least be in the room. They would certainly want to know. I'm sure Commissioner Johnson made clear the department and Velco and the ISO all have great relationships. We collaborate and talk. That's not true in every state, by the way. That is true in Vermont. We have very good relations with them and try to work collaboratively.
Tori?
I was wondering if the studies you're describing are what is called cluster studies,
Yes.
It's,
Yes.
which is new, right?
it is a new process for them. They just are now completing their first interim cluster study.
Rep Campbell?
Well, one thing, so I guess the takeaway that I'm getting is the only leverage point that we have in Vermont is siting. Is that
Well, not right. Currently, you have state rate making.
if
If the rule goes through, you would potentially lose that lever of retail rate authority over a data set. Yes, you would lose that. And you would have site. That's in the transmission level. That's all you would have left would be it would be the siting.
That's what I thought you said, and I just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
And then the other question is how data centers in Virginia are connected now. At what level are they connected? Are they connected to the transmission level? Or they connected?
I don't know the answer to that question.
So,
No, Gina.
well, PJM has a different construct than ISO New England in terms of how distribution utilities and transmission operate. We are vertically integrated in Vermont. So I don't know the difference of why one way works better than the other, but it's not an apples to apples comparison.
So I always think about you all as our most kind of conservative, careful, long-term stakeholders in terms of the energy sector. What are you most worried about?
With respect to data center.
Yeah. Yes. Please narrow your.
Yeah.
comments.
Geomagnetic disturbances.
Yeah.
No.
Well, do you want to go first?
I think that first and foremost, right, reliability is our number one goal, and it's our core responsibility. I will say that Belco also plays another role, being a voice at the regional stage, and understanding that there, are some implications with not just reliability of the grid, but how it could impact ratepayers. And so, and I'm not saying that this is my largest worry. I'm making the point that those conversations from a state to state level and having more collaboration with all of the transmission owners, so that we're in ISO New England, that we're finding the right answer that works for New England, regardless of what comes out of this ANOVER proceeding. I think at the end of the day, keeping the lights on is our biggest job. And so if there were anything happening that takes away from the reliability aspect, I mean, that would be, from a grid operator perspective, the biggest concern. But knowing that we have these procedures and mechanisms in place that are very comprehensive studies that have to take place. And it's not just, does it work with the current system? It's also, does it work with the current system that's significantly under stress? Because as we've just seen over the past 2.5 weeks, extreme weather has, plays a pretty big role in terms of the resource adequacy and understanding how the grid can operate. So I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Well, I wouldn't want to be on record or in the newspaper.
Well, there's a reporter
Saying I'm not
there.
concerned with reliability, because that's our number one job. That to me feels relatively secure and not threatened that much by the proposed FERC rule. The thing I feel like I'm channeling when you're asking Belco, but we're owned by the distribution utility.
Right.
So I'm channeling the distribution utilities here. I would be very concerned about state jurisdiction being whittled away. I think once you lose it for data centers, you may be losing it for other things. And eventually all you're going to be left with is siting, which isn't going to be you're not going to have that much skin in the game. And that's, where the state can be most protective of ratepayers.
Thank you. So great.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to give committee members a break before we go to floors. So, just to recover. So our folks. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, and we can go off live. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you.